first of all, welcome everybody here with us in the morning room and everybody who is online. Now, before I introduce Sally and her main achievement, I want to remind her of the first time I talked to you. It was on the phone, right? And, Sally was interested in doing a PhD. She wrote to me, and we had a rather long discussion on the phone. I don't think her final PhD ended up being in any way very similar to that very long discussion, but nevertheless, we accepted her, and I think we truly enjoyed working with her. So let me just introduce Sally for those of you who don't know who she is. So Sally began her career as a primary school teacher, and from there she went into management and leadership all the way to the deputy head of school, and assistant executive head of a federation of 4 schools. I think, Sally, you specialize in special educational needs, and you continue with that once she moved to higher education as an associate, initial teacher training lecturer. She then moved as an associate lecturer at the Open University in the Faculty of Wellbeing, Education and Language Studies. So she's a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and her research interests are in the field of well-being, and that is where she spent quite a few years, I forgot how many, quite a few years looking at the well-being of PGR students, and that is what she's going to talk about. So thank you very much for joining again, and enjoy Sally's lecture. And I think I have just to
share the slides.
There you go. Okay, Sally, they're all for you.
Okay, so got an introduction from me, so you know who I am and where I come from. So can I just say welcome and thank you for coming and making the effort to come today. I really appreciate it. And to my supervisors for providing this opportunity for me to actually talk about what I've been doing for the last 6 years. The context for the research is higher education in England. And as Christina suggested, it has come from my experiences in education generally. So I was informed really by many years of working in special educational needs and thinking about people's more complex needs. And when I got into higher education, it seemed to be more about well-being than it was about any other area. And initially, that's what I wanted to look at was undergraduate students. But there were a range of circumstances which meant that I had to change, I had to adapt, and I had to respond. And COVID was a key player in that. So the impact that it was having on my peers as postgraduate researchers who could no longer make contacts with their participants was an area that I felt we needed to explore. So the higher education context is really quite marketised and highly competitive. So it proposes often in the research that being a postgraduate student will be stressful and it will be problematic. And there's often this tension between being a consumer and having power to choose and be in control of what you do, and also being vulnerable and in need of support and protection. So I was quite interested in these experiences. So this long-standing and sustained interest in PGR wellbeing is really around measuring what's happening. A lot of the research looks at who is likely to have problems and what we can do about these risks, the sorts of things we can put in place to mitigate these risks. And so it's about perhaps interventions and looking at the impacts of interventions. And this is predominantly quite a medical model. It's looking at deficit. It uses language of things that are lacking, and the discussions are often around the problems that people have and the lack of well-being that people have. And this can be kind of mirrored in the broader societal context, but it's not the whole picture. And there's a research that suggests that we're problematizing experiences. Some recent work by Fawkes and Andrews, for example, suggests that the more that things are being spoken about, it's having an impact on the way that we understand our experiences. So I had read some work early on, which was by somebody called Antonovsky. And Antonovsky uses a hallucinogenic approach, and he was in health, and he was interested in promoting health. And he thought that if we only carry out research with people who have disease and illness, we're going to become really good at disease and illness. But we're not necessarily going to create a healthy society from that. We need to know what the healthy people are doing in order to learn from them. It's important that we recognise those that do have needs and we respond to those, but we can also learn from those who are just fine. So I used that as inspiration. And so my approach was, well, who are the people who are doing research at postgraduate level and who are just okay? And I wanted to bring that kind of their voice into the discussions about their experiences. So I think that listening is really important. I spent a lot of time listening to children and to families when I worked in schools, because we often skirt over things, or we think we've heard and we're busy, so we're addressing our own agendas. And when you stop and really listen to what people have to say, sometimes you hear some other things that may not immediately appear to be important, but often are central to what's happening. So I wanted to give those people an opportunity to talk about their experiences. And therefore I used an approach which is called narrative inquiry. So stories and narrative analysis, stories are not new. That's not something that's new to us. It's deeply embedded really in human activity. You can see it across time and across place. People tell stories. And Frank, for example, with his work, suggests that we don't opt in to tell stories. It's an essential part of human activity. We have to tell stories to help us make sense of our experiences and those things that happen around us. So storytelling is an essential part of our human existence. Our lives are stories. So what I wanted to do was give these participants an opportunity to talk about whatever they felt was important. Stories can be used to join dots over time. They can talk about the past, the current point in time, and also about preferred futures or possibilities in future. And one of the surprising outcomes, the unexpected outcome from this research, was that the participants, in their reflections, said how talking about their well-being had a positive impact on their well-being. So listening to people's stories about well-being has potential to have a positive impact on your well-being, because you can hear what other people have done. You can learn from that. If the story isn't your story, there may be things within that you can connect with, and that might help you make sense of your experiences. But I hadn't considered that talking about your well-being would have an impact on your well-being, but that was their reflections. So they felt that it was quite empowering and that it affirmed their thoughts and their actions. So it enhanced their feelings of well-being. So in that sense, stories can be transformative. Okay, so the review of the literature established that there was a lack of consensus around the definition of the term well-being. So there are lots of different words used in lots of different settings, lots of different contexts, and it's presented as problematic because it means that different pieces of research come together and they don't necessarily relate to each other because they've used different words or different measures. There's a whole lot of models and ways of understanding it and explaining it, but they don't necessarily fit together. So I asked my participants to define well-being, but I didn't ask them until the end of their interview. So at the beginning, I asked them to tell me about their well-being. And at the end, I asked them to define it. So I didn't frame it in any way. I wanted that to be open because I wanted to give people the opportunity to talk about what they felt was important. So I will come back to that. the first thing I did with all the transcripts and all the information was have a look at it and organise it. And the first thing is called reflexive thematic analysis. This is a Braun and Clark approach, and it's about organising ideas and putting them into themes. And this was the first thing that I did. And I'm not going to talk too much about this today because I want to focus on the story aspect of the work. But just to say that there were 13 themes, and these were essentially the things that people do. These are the kind of actions. These are the kinds of, they changed their thoughts, or they changed their attitudes, or they did practically something different. So there are a couple of examples there of things that people did. If you want to know more about that, I'm happy to talk about it at another point. But what came from there was the two overarching themes were one, firstly, that they felt that they can do things, and secondly, that they had this sense of belonging. And for universities, this is quite an important part because they felt belonging in relation to their PhD. So sometimes about their department or about their being with their peers, but they also felt that belonging in groups and communities outside of their education was vitally important to their well-being. So if universities are interested in supporting student well-being, they need to be listening to what they need, because it might be about opportunities to make connections in the local community with groups that have nothing to do with university, because they perceive themselves holistically. So what I did do was reflexive dialogical narrative analysis. So this is what I wanted to do, was get into the stories. The things that people do are really useful and important and can be applied and learned. We can use them, but it didn't really tell us why they were doing the things that they were doing. Whereas the narrative analysis, now, to begin by defining it is tricky, because there are lots of different sorts of narrative analysis that you can do. You can do structural, you can do performative, you can do rhetorical. So there are all sorts of different approaches. And I use this dialogical narrative approach, which was leading really from the work of Frank and by Smith. So these two, Frank published a book in 2010 called Let Stories Breathe. And it's about looking at the stories that people are telling and making sense of those. And Smith explains there isn't a kind of prescribed process for doing this. You don't do one thing and then the next thing. It's an iterative process where you need to keep coming back, asking questions of and interrogating that data. So that's the approach that I took. And I'm going to separate stories and narrative now, because those two terms are often used interchangeably as well. So for the purposes of this research, I used a story being comprised of 6 elements. So an abstract indicates that the story is going to be told. The orientation provides time and place and introduces characters. The complicating event, which is possibly something out of the ordinary, but definitely something that requires some kind of response. And the resolution that indicates that the story's ended, although this might be an action that continues, so it's not necessarily that the issue is concluded. And then there's some sort of evaluation of the story that indicates an attitude towards that story, which the listener is invited to share. And then there's a coda, which is the point at which the storyteller stops. So a story, in that sense, is quite contained and quite meets that specific criteria. Now, a narrative itself is not structured as a story, because a narrative isn't a story. A narrative is a kind of umbrella term that serves to encompass many places, characters and plots, but they share points of reference. So there can be differences within those stories, but they're within that bigger narrative. So for the purposes of this analysis, I looked at the stories and organised them into narratives, and each narrative then represents a range of stories. And the process that I used was to familiarise myself with the stories, and there were 13 participants, so 13 big stories. Within those big stories, there were lots of small stories, and using that criteria of what is a story, I pulled out the small stories and looked at organising those to see how they fitted or where they might have been connected in order to create those narratives. So that takes time, because you need to kind of capitalize these organising ideas or these concepts. So it's a complex process going backwards and forwards, and thinking about the impact and the influence that you have on that. But again, it's a different way of listening. So the findings from there were around time, place, and society. So time was used by everybody and not necessarily chronologically. So, for example, everybody talked about COVID. It was July 2020. So if you can think back to that point, we were in the first lockdown and we were coming towards the time when we were allowed to start meeting people again with quite a lot of restrictions still. So they all talked about the time before COVID, during COVID, so they'd experienced that from March until July, and they were all talking about anticipating this change in the lockdown rules and this future time. So everybody used that time. They also all used the time frame of their studies, their doctorate. So where they were, they talked about at which point they were in that process. Place orients the stories, and geographically they were spread around the world. So they positioned themselves in terms of the world, but also there was a lot of local geography there, lots of things about place and the locality, and almost even within, because we were in lockdown, about movements around places. So they were very, very localised, because sometimes you weren't going very far at all. Sometimes you're moving from room to room. And there were lots of, so this was about inside and outside often. And there were lots of discussions around journeys, because people were moving or going for walks or going to a certain place or not being able to do certain things. And the societal stuff was about relationships, about social interactions, and about cultural norms. So that included things like spiritual or religious and all sorts of different communities. So these 13 big stories, I looked at all these smaller stories, and what I found were 3 narratives: the narrative of adapting, of growing, and balancing. So I have an adapting narrative, a growing narrative, and a balancing narrative. So the growing narrative suggests that participants were resisting this dominant discourse, this common idea that the narrative, so the discourse is and a dominant discourse is the idea that it's the narrative explanation that provides the standard story. So the dominant idea that it was going to be difficult and it was going to be stressful and it was going to be challenging and that was going to have a negative impact on your well-being, because they resist that, and they talk about having challenge through the PhD, but that being a really positive thing, that they like being challenged. They want and need challenge in order to have a sense of well-being. And in fact, lots of them had all sorts of challenges in their personal lives that they chose to do. So while they were doing doctorates, they were also learning other languages or learning musical instruments or competing in like national sporting events or running races and improving their personal bests. And sometimes they use challenges to help them with the challenge of their studies. So I can remember an example of somebody who set themselves a running race, and they'd set a time that they wanted to get, which was one of their personal bests. And their kind of story was like, if I can get that time in that race, then I know I can definitely get this doctorate finished. It's like pushing yourself in different ways to kind of force yourself to acknowledge that you can do these things. So it challenged that idea that the challenge was negative. They changed their ideas and their attitudes a little bit to be a bit more understanding of themselves. So they were growing in terms of their skills. They were growing in terms of themselves and kind of self-compassion, learning to be kind to yourself. So if you set yourself targets and then you don't make them, that's okay. That's life sometimes. It's not necessarily that you've failed or you've done it wrong or you're not good enough. So they were much more forgiving and compassionate towards themselves. So they developed their skills of research. And there's this discussion between structure and agency in theory a lot of the time. Like, are people doing things because they're forced to by the structural factors that constrain them, or do they have agency and can they Can they choose, and are they free, regardless of the structure? And it's not an everlasting, ongoing debate, but it was pertinent here to see how people were responding. The adapting narrative. So these small stories were striking because although they were often born out of a problem or a challenge, and so they did say what the problem was or the challenge was, but they used that as a catalyst for change. So they didn't go into lots of details about the problem. They were providing that as the context for the change that they'd made. So sometimes that was about behavioural or about attitudes, or it could have been on practical changes. So sometimes it was about going back to things they'd done before. So there was somebody who was quite high in their competitive sporting activities, and they put it aside when they started their PhD. They were like, I can't do everything, so I'm just going to shelve that and do the PhD. And then as time went on, they realised that they weren't really very happy and something was missing. And they realised that they needed that challenge in the sporting event in order to have that sense of feeling okay. So they went back to not competing at the same level, but regularly taking part in that sporting activity in order to be feeling well enough to continue with their studies. So sometimes it was about adapting to new circumstances or changing practices. So the kind of empowering nature and acknowledgement of their agency in this was important. Student engagement is significant because, as recognised, this neoliberal context, which is suggesting that they're not going to be well, but they're going to necessarily have this lack of well-being. But actually, they responded positively to these, and they experienced all sorts of challenges. I mean, it wasn't that these people sailed through their PhDs without any changes in their research. So everybody was impacted by COVID. Some people had started to do their research, they started collecting data, and then they had to stop. They couldn't go and talk to anybody anymore. They had to think about different ways of data collecting and the impact that would have on their analysis and their questions. Some people had to change their research altogether and do something completely different because that was no longer likely to happen during this time frame. And some people chose to pause and step away. So there was that side, along with the challenges that you have when you're doing your own research, and people experience personal challenges as well. So, you know, in a period of 5 or 6 years, things happen in your life. You know, people had babies and people passed away and people changed jobs and moved house and got divorced and remarried, and all sorts of things like that were happening as well. So these people were not saying they were on top of the world and they were sailing through life. They were getting through life, but they had a sense of well-being. And the third narrative is around balance. So the balancing narrative, balance is mentioned in theory and in models, but balancing in this case was about balancing all sorts of different things. And so that image there is showing that it's not simply one thing against another. Sometimes you're balancing uneven things and trying to even them up. So they talked about balancing as a process, balancing your doctorate study with your life, so that work-life balance, with your leisure activities, with your employment commitments. Lots of people are working full-time, part-time. They were working and trying to adapt to work during COVID. So if you worked in education, you were then teaching online. They talked about the difference between cerebral activity and physical activity. They talked about balancing being inside and outside. They talked about balancing the mental and the physical, and that brought in things like food and sleep and meditation, so that body and mind balance. Sometimes that was by an imbalance. What they recognised was their well-being was holistic and that this required constant reappraisal and adjustment. So it wasn't a case of finding the place of balance, it was a case of constantly having to be balanced. Because every time anything changed, it impacts on everything else. So people talked about recognising that they felt that they were not spending as much time with their families as they'd like to. And so they assessed the hours of the day and looked at how much time do I have to spend at work, how much and when do I need to spend time on my research, and what do I want to do with my family. And they plotted out all the hours in the day and changed their working day so that they were taking time out at the time when they had a young child. When that child came home, they were available to be a family member at tea time and bedtime, and then they fitted their working around that. And that eased the way that they were feeling about that situation. So you can see how things like COVID impact on that and change that, have potential to change that balance. In many ways, the changes during COVID provided more opportunities for people to think creatively about things like using their time. So it wasn't all negative. So those narratives brought the what people did to kind of why they did it. It added some kind of interest and colour, and it brought those actions or those activities to life, because the stories help you to connect with them. So to return to the question of defining well-being, how do they define their well-being? So this lack of consensus, which is perceived to be problematic, the vocabulary sometimes used interchangeably. I asked them at the end to talk about it, and without exception, they all use metaphors. So I didn't use metaphor elicitation. That's a way of data collection. You can say, tell me about this, use a metaphor. Use a metaphor to tell me about your experience of this. I didn't ask them to tell. They'd used metaphors all the way through the whole interviews. And it became a bit of my problem of the metaphor, because I didn't really know what to do with them. I kept putting them into different categories, and then I kept thinking these should be looked at on their own. There's something happening with these metaphors, and I don't really know what to do with them. But in this aspect, how do they define it? They all use metaphors, and I thought, okay, what can I do with this? How can I make this work? So a metaphor is a compressed comparison. It's a way of describing something in terms of something else. It's not a simile, because we don't use like or as. And I knew about them because I've been a teacher. So in year 4, we'd done figurative language. We'd done metaphors and similes in poetry, make your writing more creative and flowery. That's what I thought they were all about. But I found online a lecture which was offered by, it was given to Sally Zacharias, and it was part of the University of Glasgow's School of Education Open Lecture Series on educational research. And it was titled, Gaining Insights into Ways of Thinking, Analysing Metaphor in Written and Spoken Texts. So, fantastic. I went along to this, and it was really enlightening, and it showed me a whole new world that I didn't know existed. It's in the field of linguistics, so it was quite a kind of interdisciplinary move, because I don't know, I'm not a linguist. So I kind of stepped into things I didn't really know much about, but she signposted, so she talked about her own work and signposted lots of other people in the field, which gave me the opportunity to find out more about it. And there's a key players in here. In the 1980s, Lakoff and Johnson established that the use of metaphor is cognitive. So they wrote a book called Metaphors We Live By. And in this work, this has led the field really, but this suggested that we use metaphors in our thought. We don't just choose them as vocabulary choices when we're trying to communicate. We think using metaphor. So, for example, so they talk about these big metaphors, for example, the journey metaphor, which is what I've used here visually. And they suggest that it's part of our thinking. So a central component of human communication, because it's not just about vocabulary choices. They suggest that it's rooted in our thinking and that we think metaphorically. So they serve to kind of bridge what we know with things we don't know. They kind of ease that passage into the unknown from what we do understand. And they're often used with abstract concepts and complicated thoughts, so feelings, and they're linking that to something much more concrete. Now, they are positioned within the social cultural context because of the points of reference. You know, if you think about the metaphors that you've come up, you've probably not thought about metaphors as much as me, but when you start to think about metaphors, there's often loads of references to things that are from your childhood or from stories that are shared stories that we know, or points of reference in culture. So that we've got that shared connection there. But it opens up this whole new world to me. So metaphor analysis involves identifying metaphors and in this case, this was in terms of the wellbeing research. So I only looked at their responses to how do you define wellbeing. And some people gave like one sentence, and some people gave me a couple of paragraphs, and I only looked at that. The process of analysing metaphor requires you to become familiar with those texts. So I separated those from the rest of the transcripts and looked at those as completely separate. There was a passing of time between the dialogical narrative analysis, which gave me a bit of scope to kind of step back and refocus on these. So you identify within your text anything you think is a potential metaphor. And then you have to evaluate these potential metaphors. And in that, you end up rejecting some. So I created exclusion criteria, which was if they used a metaphor, but it didn't relate to the definition of well-being. So, for example, somebody might have said something like, oh, this springs to mind. So I wouldn't use that because they're not talking about well-being, they're talking about the process of thinking. If they repeated, so often people said the same thing and then they would say it again later on to kind of confirm or clarify. So something like having peace within yourself might have been said more than once in a paragraph. So I wouldn't look at it twice so that it's reoccurring because it's coming from that same person. Or sometimes you thought it was a metaphor, and then when you came back and you looked at it again, you thought, no, this isn't a metaphor. So, you know, what is a metaphor is a whole new world. But to give you some examples, then I'll give you an example in a moment. So if I take that having peace within yourself, if I look at it, I'd break it down into peace, and I'd say the meaning of peace is about a quietness or a freedom from war. But metaphorically, that could mean calm or harmony. So the difference between the concrete and the conceptual there gives you that idea about metaphor. And within yourself, the meaning is inside your body, but metaphorically, that's about containment, or it could be about ownership. So that would be justified as being a metaphor. Having peace within yourself would be a metaphor, and that would be part of the analysis. So that evaluation of the metaphors was quite an iterative process. I had to keep going back to them. You had to look at them, go back, question, talk to your peers and your wonderful supervisors until you're really clear that what you've got are the essence of those metaphors. And then you look at grouping those potential metaphors to create structural metaphors. And these metaphors I could use then to compare to what I'd found with the reflexive thematic analysis. Were there any links or connections? And the dialogical narrative analysis, is this completely separate or does this connect? So it had its own outcomes as metaphor analysis, what the people think about well-being, but it also fitted into that bigger picture. Okay, so systematic metaphors, 4. So these 25 metaphors I had when I distilled it all down, and they are well-being as contained. So that having peace within would fit within that contained metaphor. And there were lots of examples for all of these. They were fairly evenly spread. They also talked about others. So well-being as others. Now, this is in recognition that their well-being wasn't just about themselves. Although it was contained, it was also affected and influenced by those around them. So, for example, they were very aware of it, and they would say things like, it's not necessarily my own physical and mental health, it's those around me. If those around me are okay, then I'm okay. But I can't be okay if those around me are not okay. And there was also an awareness that I can't be okay if it's at the expense of other people being okay. So I can't be okay if if the outcomes of me being okay are impacting negatively on other people. I have to be aware of the impact that I'm having on other people. So although they kind of owned it and contain it, they were also connected to those around them. The idea of movement is, they said things like you need to keep yourself on a level, or you need to do things which you enjoy, which will help you to rise and learn. So this idea that it wasn't about staying still, it was about movement. And then the equilibrium. So this was really about this mental and physical balance. So it was about having a state of mental and physical balance, or some sort of homeostasis, this balance between your physical and your mental, your body and your thoughts. So for systematic metaphors, how does that link back to what I was asking, what I was thinking about in the beginning? So despite the lack of consensus around the definition of well-being and being perceived to be problematic in the field, actually what this suggests is there's quite a lot of overlap, but the thinking using metaphor has provided quite a lot of commonalities in the way that it was defined, which made me think again about, is it necessary to try and find a definition which we all agree? Or does that become a kind of sideline? Is it a distraction where we're talking about different words, but we've all got slightly different meanings and understandings with those words, and we can feel uncomfortable about somebody else's vocabulary? The metaphors suggest that our thinking is quite aligned. And so I had quite a big kind of roots, a bit of a sign of relief that I don't need to establish a consensus, because I could see through the use of metaphor that people already had some kind of consensus. Okay, so the commonalities in the way that the participants defined well-being suggest that perhaps it's not as problematic as I initially thought, or as thought in the field. So then these combined findings. So I've done 3 modes of data analysis now. I hadn't intended to. The metaphors it was fortuitous that I came across the theory and the theorists that gave me the context to explore those. But I have 3. They all fitted within my the rationale for doing this research. They each provided something specific. The reflexive thematic analysis told us what people did. The dialogical narrative analysis told us why they were doing it, the stories behind it. And the metaphor analysis told us a bit about their thoughts, what they were thinking, how they were defining it. And so when you put all of those findings together and then you look at them as a whole, what did I have from looking at the same information from 3 different lenses? So listening from 3 different perspectives, what did I have? Well, they considered their well-being holistically. They all talked about their whole lives. They all talked about the relationships, their positions. They talked about their doctorates, but as part of their whole lives. The implications for higher education are quite significant there, because it isn't all about meeting their needs within a higher education institution. There are aspects which related to the higher education institution, but it wasn't all about that. It was about perhaps facilitating other things to happen, or enabling other things to happen, which would mean that the research or the postdoctoral role would be more successful. So, for example, one participant used the phrase, going outside, being with animals, being able to be in the garden helps me keep my head on straight, and that means I'm a better researcher. So if you want to support people, you need to understand what's important for them in order for them to be better researchers. It's not necessarily about more things in the university. They They recognised wellbeing as dynamic, so they all knew that it changed. They'd all experienced things. We'd all had COVID experience, so we were living in COVID. We'd had pre-COVID. We were hoping a post-COVID. One of my peers talks about peri-COVID. We've never really come past it. We're in a zone of still COVID, but it's constantly changing. And they recognised that their thoughts and actions, they could change, and they did things with, and they adapted. So they demonstrated in that agency. That an agency is about humans having capacity to act, and those actions making differences. So the three components fed into this central act, really, which is of balancing, and balancing ran across all three of those modes of analysis. And balancing was articulated as this ongoing process that spans all aspects of their lives. They engage with it all the time, constantly responding to it. Sometimes they were making tiny tweaks, and sometimes they were making seismic shifts, but they were constantly aware that this balancing was part of what they do. They weren't looking for a place, they were part of that process. So I think in terms of recommendations and thinking forwards, stories have potential to be transformative. So my first recommendation was to encourage or empower other PGRs to share their stories of wellbeing, and for higher education context to resist that being framed as a deficit, and that being a discussion about wellbeing, which is about the problem of wellbeing, or about people's lack of wellbeing, or the barriers to their wellbeing. It's about facilitating discussions about I'm just a person doing some stuff, and I'm coming up against problems, and I've done this, and it's not necessarily earth-shatteringly new information, but it's sharing things that we do. So it's about back to that hallucinogenic approach to wellbeing and health promotion. It's about learning from those who are okay. Like, why? How come you're still here? How come you haven't? How come? What is it about your experiences that mean that you're still here? That's the hallucinogenic approach to wellbeing. So listening to the voices of people who have a sense of wellbeing is really important, but also sharing stories has a positive impact on your wellbeing. So if you share your own story, then that might have a positive impact on your own wellbeing. And on a kind of larger scale, I think it's important that this group of participants are able to contribute to discussions about wellbeing, because they're not a kind of standard excluded voice in terms of a marginalised group in society, but I'm not convinced that their voice is being part of their wellbeing discourse. And I think it would be a good opportunity to think about what do we want from wellbeing on that larger scale, and whose voices are being represented in that, and how can we open that up to include people who are okay or have some sense of wellbeing. Self-defined. Nobody said you meet the criteria to say that we've measured your wellbeing and you have enough wellbeing to take part in this study. The criteria was, if you think you have a sense of wellbeing and you're doing a doctorate, please participate. So they felt that, not anybody else. I read something very recently by Fox and Andrews, and it was called the prevalence inflation hypothesis. And this was their concerns around talking about mental health and wellbeing. A lot is making us think about wellbeing and mental health a lot, framed within this deficit discourse. And so what I would like to do is kind of add to that and turn it the other way, so that we're promoting and raising things that are stories that are okay about wellbeing alongside those. So we need those. We need people we need specialists, but we do also need to know about those who are okay. So in terms of reflections, I'm coming to the end, which will give you a chance to ask me any questions if you'd like to. This research is a small piece of qualitative research. It doesn't provide definitive answers or claim to reveal the truth about anything. It does, however, bring some evidence to help us understand the nature of PGR student wellbeing. And I think that there are some aspects of this which apply to undergraduate students and students in as I say, my experiences in primary education, but with children, and actually with possibly with just people. It's a big claim. It's worth testing out. So, I mean, I would like to encourage you to share your own stories and let me know how you get on with that. I didn't ask my participants whether I could come back to them and ask them about their actions and whether they'd shared stories with other people as a result of doing the research. So that's the one thing that I wish I had done, is to see whether that taking part had given them the idea that it contributed to their well-being, and therefore they just started to talk about their well-being in other contexts. So that would possibly be an interesting area to follow up on and see what people are doing out there when they're not partaking in research. So narrative inquiry provided this opportunity for people with a sense of well-being to share their stories. And using narrative analysis, I was able to use different modes of analysis to look at the data. So I got the why from the reflexive thematic analysis. I got from the dialogical narratives. I got the what from the reflexive thematic analysis. I got the why from the stories, and the use of metaphor gave me an insight into their conceptual understanding of well-being, and that helped me to see a bit more closely how they were thinking. So altogether, that feeds into that whole idea that it's ongoing. It's not a place that you get to, like an end. It's about being part of that and being able to keep listening and keep responding, because in terms of supporting well-being, there aren't any easy one fits answers. But if we listen to the people that we're aiming to support, we're going to be in a better position to support them in the future. And I think that is pretty much where I'm at. So that's kind of so I'm really into metaphor now. So metaphorical, that's my journey. That's my PhD. That's me at the beginning, in the middle, and now winning with the tennis ball at the end. So I'm finished here. I graduated last month, and as a result, my email will cease to be. So if you do want to contact me at any point in the future, please feel free to use that email address. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to. Thank you.
Well done, Sally. Amazing.
I think there's a reference list on the end of there. If you want to read my references.
She's been a great student, let me tell you. Thank you so much, Sally. I have some things I've got to say now.
Okay.
Okay.
Any questions?
I'm coming to that in a minute, Sally. Okay. So colleagues and friends, for anybody who doesn't know, I was one of Sally's supervisors with Dr. Christina Devecchi. I'm Professor Jane Murray. Thank you, Sally. And thank you, all of you, for coming today to learn from Sally. It's been such a privilege to hear her today. I'm sure you'll all agree. 80,000 words. 6 years, 2 examiners, and you've managed to cram it all into just under an hour. That on its own is a significant achievement, so well done, Sally. And Sally's thesis, as she's been telling us, focuses on well-being. And this at a time when well-being has probably never been more prominent. And having Sally as a PhD student was certainly really good for the well-being of Christina and myself as her supervisors, I have to say. And Sally, today might feel a little bit like the end. It's the end of your PhD, or your first PhD, we might say. You might joke, one of our visiting professors here at the University of Northampton has 3 doctorates to his name, so we can only aspire, all of us, can't we? But really, Sally, this is the beginning. It's the beginning of propagating this incredible knowledge that you've produced, the beginning of using your PhD research as a springboard for future research and future learning, your own future research and future learning, and that of others. And Sally, as researchers, we all stand on those shoulders of giants. And I think today you've shown all of us that you are a very worthy giant. I'm a bit tearful because I'm so proud of you, Sally. You've got to stay in touch.
I will. I definitely will.
So I'm just going to give Sally another round of applause, all of you, and then we'll go to questions. Sally, I think you can come into the frame here, then colleagues who are not in the room can actually answer questions. So any questions, folks, that you would like to share with us? We've got anybody coming in. Yes. Come to you in one moment, Jade, if I may. We're going to ask Matri. Matri,
hi, Sally. It's Matri. Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you, Matri. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I missed when you talked about your sample. I'm just curious to know what was the age range and criteria for selection.
It was quite a range, actually. That's a good question. I had 13 participants, and they were evenly split in terms of male and female. They were across different departments. So there were some in education. They were really quite split. There wasn't a cluster in any particular group. There's some in sports, some in business, some in psychology, health. Some were in England near the university. Some were in England and not near the university that they studied in. Some were in a different country to the university that they studied in. And some were away from home but living near their university. So there was quite a range. It wasn't a particular group. So some of those people were, I think probably I can't remember the proportion actually, but some had dependent children, and I think it was probably roughly half. Okay. Some were working part-time, some were working full-time, and some were doing their PhDs full-time, so they weren't working. So there was a mixture in terms of how they were going about their study as well.
How many of them?
Yeah, 13.
Okay. And I have one more question. So what are your future plans with these findings?
That's a good question. I'm just about writing papers about the findings and about using multiple modes of methodology. Mm-hmm. So I became more interested in the use of looking at the same data, but we're using a different lens of analysis. So okay. I'm quite interested in developing methodologically as well as sharing this idea and joining the debate about well-being and with peers and perhaps even wider, as I kind of suggested. I don't think this is exclusively about postgraduate researchers.
Okay, yeah, thank you. All the very best.
Thank you very much. So thank you for your question, Matri.
Thank you, Matri. Jade has a question.
I was just wondering, because you spoke quite specifically about analysis on what people said about well-being and principles. Yep. I was just wondering if you related to any other definitions on well-being, just in social theory or otherwise, just to cross-reference if any metaphors come close to the actual definition.
Well, there are so many different definitions. It's hard to decide which definition you would choose. So I chose for myself, and to frame it at the beginning of the thesis, inspired by the work of Dodge et al., which is about a place between challenges and resources. And that looks like a seesaw. And that was my starting point, although I didn't put that onto the participants because I wanted them to have their own. But I changed that in the thesis. By the time I got to the end, because I realised it wasn't a place, it's more about a process. So I think, no, I mean, I used and made reference to various models, but and liked aspects of some of them and bits of others of them. So the idea that you're drawing on resources and using those to address challenges, I think, is probably the...
Just to spin off, do you think that you're going to have a definition of your own, maybe?
No, I did think I would, but I don't think so, because I think that it's possibly a kind of semantic distraction, and that if you want to do research with people about well-being, and this is easy for me to say as a qualitative, small-scale researcher, I would ask people, what do you mean by well-being? And then I would go with that, because there's no point me trying to impose a definition. Whoever's, we've made collective decisions and definitions about things in schools and in education. We say, this is our definition, this is the one that we're adopting as an organisation. If people don't agree with it or don't understand it, or they think something different, that isn't going to work. So I think for me, I thought, no, I'm not going to define it. If I work with people about well-being, I'll ask them to tell me what they mean by well-being, so that I understand their stance and take that as the way forward. Thanks for the question. That was a good question and a big turnaround from where I started.
I think, Rosie, did you have a question? His hand was up earlier.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Rosie. Welcome.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you'd be able to hear me.
Yep.
Yeah, so I was gonna thank you very much, Sally. It was amazing to see you and to listen to you. Because I was gonna ask, because I'm particularly right in the middle of my PhD. I actually relate to your dogs would be the other way around. Like the first one, I was really enthusiastic because I do field work, so I love that. But now I feel like the other dog that's looking glum, right, like in the middle of the process. I find that being in your head and the whole analysis and having to write this in a way that people can understand is extremely daunting. So I just wanted to ask, through your research and what you asked your participants, what kind of growing techniques or adapting techniques or balancing techniques did they use to overcome that moment that you're like, in which I'm in, that you're unsure, that you'd saying, oh, shall I start doing this thing on? Then I'm like, start writing another chapter, and then I just like going crazy. So what did you learn from that you could recommend to me?
I think that you are possibly more interested in the reflexive thematic analysis and the things that people do, Rosie, and I can share those with you, and I can talk about those in more detail. But the sorts of things I think are significant are around managing the voice within. Sometimes the one on your shoulder that tells you you're not good enough, or you can't do it, or shouldn't be here, or that yours isn't a proper PhD and everybody else's is, and you should have done it in science, and all those kinds of things. It's managing that voice so that you don't let it take over. A bit of questioning and self-doubt can be useful. It saves you becoming arrogant and overconfident, but managing that voice to say, this is what happens, that, and being kind to yourself when things don't work out as you hope. Oh, today I'm going to sit down and write a chapter. And then you get to 7 p.m. and you haven't written anything, and you think, oh, I can't do this, I'm a failure, I haven't written anything. It's about, sometimes you have to do thinking in order to write. So it's about being kind to yourself and learning from where your strengths are. On a practical level, it's like climbing a mountain. I know it's a metaphor, again, you can't avoid them once you start thinking about them, but climbing the mountain, we never just go in one go. We take a tiny step, and then we pause. So it's about setting targets, sometimes tiny targets, and working towards them and ticking them off so that you see the achievements, because that feeds your motivation. So I think connecting with other people who are on a similar route to you, and the connections I have, the people who I have got through this with and because of, are people who are not in my field. I have a really good friend that I connected with at a virtual conference, and we've done various bits of work together. We've done webinars, we've done seminars, we've written a paper together. We talk regularly and we meet on Teams to write together. So we just come, log on, say what we're going to do, write. I have another friend, we do that on a very regular basis, every day, meet, write together, move on. So we can say to each other, oh my gosh, I've been here all day and I haven't written anything, or not really, because you do more progress than that. But you know, you can set your targets with your peers, and that helps you to be realistic about what you can achieve, because then they'll understand it. So find your connections, people that make sense to you, and they don't have to be in your field. Like I say, I have a really good friend in psychology, a really good friend in health. You know, we don't have the same subject knowledge, but we have the experience. But if you want to talk about reflexive thematic analysis, I'm happy to do that. Okay.
Yeah, I would probably be using it in part of what I'm going to be analyzing. So I'm doing ethnography, but also I have interviews, questionnaires. So I'm going to apply thematic analysis to those. Thank you so much. It was so lovely to see you.
You too. I can share those findings with you though, so you can use those for yourself. Okay.
I will write you an email. So yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you for your question.
Okay, and I think that just about brings us to the end. And I think you've got some lovely things that are going to happen to you next. You're going to be having some nice times with your family, I think.
Yes.
And your friends. So we want to say a big thank you once again to Sally for sharing her brilliant research.